The tool was a turkey baster.
A very common household item.
Right, exactly. It is an object that exists in millions of kitchens across the world. It is completely mundane, it is domestic, and usually associated with holiday preparations, with family gatherings, with warmth. But in the case we are analyzing today, that domestic object was repurposed. It became an instrument of a really agonizing death. We were looking at a case out of New York State that involves not just one murder, but a calculated pattern of poisoning that went undetected for years. It involves a mother, two husbands, and a terrifying attempt to frame her own daughter for the crimes. The central figure is Stacey Castor, a woman who the media later dubbed the Black Widow.
It is a case that stands out in the annals of criminal history. This is not just because of the method of killing, which was poisoning with ethylene glycol. We commonly know that substance as antifreeze, but it stands out primarily for the psychological profile of the perpetrator. The presiding judge in her trial stated that she was in a class all by herself. We were analyzing a very specific kind of pathology here. It is one that allowed a person to view family members, even her own biological children, not as human beings, but as disposable objects to be utilized for financial gain or self-preservation.
Yeah, that pathology is exactly what we need to unpack. Let us set the scene before we get into the timeline. The events took place largely in Clay and Weedsport, New York. This is upstate. It is a generally quiet area, the kind of place where, neighbors know each other. Doors might even be left unlocked. Stacey Castor, who was born Stacey Ruth Daniels, seemed to live a relatively normal life on the surface. She was a mother, she was a wife, a neighbor. But underneath that facade, there was a mechanism of calculation that is honestly hard to wrap your head around. Our mission here is to walk through the timeline of events. We will look at the forensic evidence that eventually unraveled her lies and try to understand how she managed to evade detection for as long as she did. I want to be clear from the start. This is a very heavy subject. We are dealing with betrayal of the highest order.
Precisely. And when we analyze these events, we must focus closely on the forensic inconsistencies. The narrative Stacey Castor attempted to construct, which began as a story of natural death and later shifted to a narrative of suicide, crumbled entirely. It crumbled because the physical evidence simply did not corroborate her statements. It is a textbook example of how forensic science, specifically forensic toxicology and digital forensics, can dismantle a carefully curated fabrication.
Let us go back to the beginning, because we need to understand where she came from to see if there were early warning signs or if this behavior just emerged later in life. Stacey was born on July 24, 1967. This was in Clay, New York. Her parents were Jerry Daniels and Judy Eaton. We do not have a massive amount of detail in her early childhood in the public records, but we do know that her path to adulthood began very, very early. She met her first husband, Michael Wallace, in 1984. She was only 17 years old at the time.
That is quite young from a developmental standpoint. Meeting a future spouse at 17 suggests that her adult identity was formed almost entirely within the context of this specific relationship. They married and initiated a family relatively quickly. Their first daughter, Ashley, was born in 1988. Their second daughter, Bree, followed shortly after in 1991. This rapid transition from adolescence directly into motherhood can create significant psychological and socioeconomic pressure. This is especially true if the external support systems are not robust.
And financially, they were definitely not wealthy. The records indicate the family had very little money. Stacey worked for an ambulance dispatch company. Now, that is a detail we really should keep in mind for later.
Yes, her occupation is a critical data point.
Right, because it gave her a certain familiarity with medical emergencies and response protocols. Meanwhile, Michael Wallace worked nights as a mechanic. So you have a young couple, two kids, money is tight, and they were working opposite schedules. That is a recipe for strain in any marriage.
It creates a structural disconnect within the home. When partners are functioning on opposite schedules, communication naturally degrades. That disconnect appeared to manifest clearly in the family dynamics. According to subsequent accounts from family members, Michael was closely bonded with the younger daughter, Bree. Stacey perceived this as favoritism. In response, or perhaps as a compensatory mechanism, Stacey developed a dynamic where she became what she termed best friends with the elder daughter, Ashley.
That best friend dynamic is something we are going to see play out in a truly horrific way later on. It was not just a typical mother-daughter bond. It was an alliance. It was an alliance that Stacey would eventually try to exploit. It blurred the necessary boundaries between parental authority and peer friendship. But as the years went on, the marriage to Michael Wallace began to crumble. Rumors started circulating about extramarital affairs on both sides. The couple just grew apart. It was a failing marriage. But instead of a divorce, something else happened. In late 1999, Michael Wallace started getting sick.
The clinical presentation was nonspecific initially. This is frequently observed in cases of gradual chemical poisoning. He felt intermittently ill. He presented with ataxia, meaning he was unsteady on his feet, almost appearing intoxicated even when he had not consumed alcohol. He developed a persistent cough. Family members also documented that he appeared swollen. Edema, or swelling, is a primary indicator of renal distress and fluid retention, which aligns with toxin processing in the kidneys. This persistent physiological decline continued over the holiday season in late 1999.
And despite the fact that Stacey worked for an ambulance dispatch company, she was literally in the business of emergency response. Yet, Michael did not get immediate medical attention. His family urged him to see a doctor as this sickness dragged on. They saw him physically deteriorating. But in early 2000, before he could seek that specialized care, Michael Wallace died.
The initial determination by the attending physicians was that he had suffered a fatal myocardial infarction, a heart attack. This diagnostic error is not uncommon in cases of systemic poisoning. Ethylene glycol toxicity can induce multi-organ failure that mimics natural disease processes to an untrained observer, particularly without the benefit of a comprehensive toxicology screen. However, a significant behavioral anomaly occurred immediately. Michael's sister expressed profound skepticism. She observed that his prolonged symptoms did not correlate with the sudden onset typical of a cardiac event. Consequently, she formally requested an autopsy.
And Stacey refused. She flat out refused. She told the family that she believed the doctors were correct, that it was a heart attack, and that was the end of the discussion. She shut down the request for an autopsy completely. Now, looking back, this refusal is a glaring red flag. But at the time, functioning as the grieving widow, she held the absolute legal authority to make that medical decision.
This represents a critical juncture in the timeline of her methodology. By utilizing her legal status to refuse the autopsy, Stacey actively prevented the immediate forensic discovery of the poisoning. Had an autopsy been executed in early 2000, standard toxicological analysis would have likely isolated the presence of ethylene glycol, or at minimum, the severe crystalline damage it inflicts upon renal tissues. By avoiding that scientific scrutiny, the true cause of death remained hidden. This allowed her to proceed with her life. Crucially, from a psychological perspective, it likely emboldened her. She had executed a capital offense and encountered zero legal friction. It served to reinforce an internal belief that she was capable of manipulating authoritative systems.
So Michael is buried. Life goes on. Stacey is a young widow with 2 young daughters, but she does not stay single forever. Fast forward to 2003, she marries David Castor. She takes his surname, becoming Stacey Castor. David was the owner of an air conditioning installation and repair company. He was established. He had a vital business. This seemed like a definitive step up in terms of financial stability for her.
Furthermore, Stacey integrated herself directly into the operational structure of his business. She secured the position of his office manager. This placement provided her with unfettered access to the financial architecture and the daily operations of his company. She was in a position to monitor and control the flow of capital and internal information.
And the motive here, when we look back at this with the benefit of hindsight and the exhaustive court records, it appears to be entirely traditional. Money, life insurance policies, estates. We know that she eventually manipulated David's will. She changed it to specifically exclude his son from a previous marriage. She was meticulously positioning herself to be the sole beneficiary of his entire asset portfolio. It was not enough to merely be his wife. She ensured she was the only individual who would profit from his demise.
Financial acquisition is the most statistically common motive in spousal homicide. However, the rapid escalation in this specific timeline is analytically significant. The marriage commenced in 2003. By August of 2005, a mere 24 months later, we observed the second lethal event. The initial period of marital stability, if it ever genuinely existed, deteriorated rapidly.
Let us walk through that specific day in detail. It is August 2005. Stacey calls the Onondaga County Sheriff's Office. She tells the dispatcher that her husband, David, has locked himself in their master bedroom after a domestic argument. She claims he has not been seen or heard from for a full day, and then she adds a specific detail. She tells the dispatcher that he had been depressed.
This is a calculated narrative insertion. She is preemptively framing the context before law enforcement personnel even arrive at the location. She is actively priming the first responders to evaluate the impending scene through the psychological framework of a suicide. By planting the concepts of depression and marital conflict, she is manipulating the natural cognitive biases of the investigators. When they eventually discover the body, their diagnostic reasoning will naturally bridge the gap to a self-inflicted fatality.
Sergeant Robert Willoughby responds to the call. It is coded as a standard wellness check. He arrives at the residence. He actually has to physically kick in the bedroom door because it is secured, locked from the inside. And inside that room, he finds David Castor dead.
The physical environment was deliberately staged to simulate a suicide. In close proximity to the deceased, investigators cataloged a commercial container of antifreeze. Additionally, there was a drinking glass, approximately half full of a luminescent green liquid, situated nearby.
Sergeant Willoughby later testified extensively about Stacey's reaction when the door was breached. He remembered her screaming loudly. She was yelling, "He is not dead! He is not dead!" It was a highly dramatic display. It was loud. It was deeply performative.
Relying on the immediate visual indicators at the scene, specifically the internally locked door, the commercial container, and the glass of fluid, the medical examiner initially hypothesized that David had committed suicide via the self-administration of a lethal volume of antifreeze. Antifreeze is primarily composed of ethylene glycol. It is relatively odorless but possesses a distinctively sweet taste profile. This sweetness makes it a highly effective agent in surreptitious poisonings because it can be masked within other beverages. However, the staging in this instance suggested he consumed it directly from the glass.
But the police did not just close the file and walk away. They started looking closely at the physical evidence, specifically on that glass. And this is exactly where the first major crack in her story appeared. They processed the glass for latent prints. They found Stacey's fingerprints on the glass containing the antifreeze, but they did not find a single one of David's fingerprints on that glass.
That physical reality is fundamentally incompatible with the suicide hypothesis. If David had physically poured the toxic substance and consumed it himself, the mechanics of handling the object dictate that his friction ridge detail, his fingerprints, must be present on the glass. The complete absence of his prints, juxtaposed with the presence of hers, strongly indicates he never manipulated the glass. It points to a scenario where another individual held the object, or perhaps systematically wiped the glass to remove prints but failed to remove their own, or simply placed it in the scene post-mortem.
And then the investigators searched the kitchen garbage. That is where they found the turkey baster.
Yes, this is the domestic item highlighted at the beginning of our analysis. When forensic technicians processed this specific turkey baster, they isolated two distinct components. They found chemical traces of ethylene glycol, the toxic agent, and they recovered biological material matching David Castor's DNA on the extreme tip of the instrument.
This discovery changed the entire trajectory of the case. The prosecution's working theory shifted immediately from a staged suicide to a calculated homicide. They believed Stacey utilized the turkey baster to physically force-feed David the antifreeze. But to accomplish that, he would have to be severely incapacitated, right? You cannot simply walk up to a conscious grown man and force-feed him a noxious liquid with a kitchen tool unless he is completely unable to fight back.
That is correct. The physical mechanics require incapacitation. This hypothesis aligns perfectly with the secondary evidence regarding his preceding illness. The forensic models suggest she had been administering sublethal doses of the toxin over a period of time. Once he reached the acute phase of toxicosis, characterized by profound weakness, uncontrollable vomiting, and severe loss of motor function, he lost the physical capacity to resist. It was during this period of utter helplessness that she administered the massive terminal dose utilizing the baster. It implies a scenario devoid of struggle, purely due to the victim's medically compromised state.
And her behavior during his final illness was incredibly suspicious. You have to remember, she had professional experience. She worked for an ambulance dispatch company. She intimately knew the signs of severe medical distress. Yet when David was staggering around the house and vomiting violently, completely unable to stand upright, she did not pick up the phone to call 911. She later claimed to investigators that he, quote, looked okay.
That specific assertion is analytically indefensible given her documented professional training. A human being exhibiting severe ataxia and intractable vomiting does not present as okay to a trained dispatcher. That deliberate failure to act constitutes profound negligence, which serves as strong behavioral evidence of homicidal intent. She actively monitored his physiological deterioration and consciously elected to withhold life-saving intervention.
There was also a really bizarre element regarding where she claimed the inspiration for this suicide came from. Stacey later told detectives that David got the idea to kill himself with antifreeze from a television news report. She said they were sitting around watching a true crime story about Lynn Turner.
The Lynn Turner case is a documented precedent. Lynn Turner was a female offender in the state of Georgia who was convicted of murdering two intimate partners, specifically utilizing antifreeze as the toxic agent. Stacey attempted to leverage that real-world case as the explanatory mechanism for David's supposed method of suicide. She stated that David watched the broadcast and remarked that it would be an effective method of death. However, behavioral analysis suggests the inverse is true. It is highly probable that Stacey herself studied the Lynn Turner case to refine her methodology. It introduces a copycat variable, but she aggressively attempted to project the ideation onto the victim.
As the police investigation into David's death deepened, the detectives started looking for a wider pattern. They recognized they were dealing with a highly organized individual, so they set up covert surveillance on Stacey's house. But they also did something else. They set up surveillance on the local cemetery, specifically on the grave sites.
Michael Wallace and David Castor were interred in adjacent plots. This specific arrangement was executed at Stacey's direct request. The investigative team formulated a behavioral hypothesis. If she was genuinely functioning as a traumatized, grieving widow who had tragically lost two spouses to separate devastating events, her behavioral pattern would likely include visits to their final resting place. They deployed surveillance units to monitor the location.
And what exactly did they see during this extended period of surveillance?
They observed a complete absence of activity. She did not visit the cemetery, not a single time during the entire duration of the surveillance operation. This negative data point cast severe doubt on the validity of her grieving widow persona. It indicated a profound emotional detachment and a clinical coldness toward the individual she had buried.
This realization led the investigators to the truly inevitable conclusion. If she killed David with a chemical agent, and her first husband Michael had died mysteriously young with symptoms that closely mirrored a severe toxicological event, they absolutely needed to check Michael.
Consequently, the district attorney's office secured a legal order to exhume the biological remains of Michael Wallace. This procedure occurred several years following his initial internment in 2000. It is important to note that the specific chemical evidence associated with ethylene glycol poisoning possesses remarkable durability within deceased tissue.
Let us pause and talk about that forensic science for a moment, because it is fascinating. What exactly were the pathologists looking for during this second autopsy? The actual liquid antifreeze would surely be long gone after being buried for years, wouldn't it?
Correct. The forensic pathologists were not attempting to locate the raw liquid compound. They were conducting histological examinations to identify calcium oxalate crystals. The human metabolic process breaks down ethylene glycol first into glycolic acid and subsequently into oxalic acid. This oxalic acid aggressively binds with calcium ions naturally present in the bloodstream to precipitate these specific crystals. The crystals rapidly accumulate within the renal system and other internal organs. They do not degrade post-mortem. They persist as immutable physical evidence of the toxicological event. They function essentially as microscopic, jagged stones that physically lacerate and destroy the cellular structure of the kidneys.
And when the toxicology results from Michael's exhumed body finally came back, they were positive.
The tissue samples from Michael Wallace demonstrated massive accumulations of these calcium oxalate crystals. The forensic conclusion was definitive. He had been murdered via antifreeze poisoning, utilizing the exact same mechanism as David Castor.
This was the absolute smoking gun. It instantly turned a complex single homicide investigation into a confirmed double homicide investigation. It established a concrete modus operandi. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the death of David Castor was not an isolated incident. It was her established method of operation.
The forensic data confirmed the serial nature of her offenses. She executed the initial murder, successfully evaded legal consequences due to the lack of an autopsy, and subsequently replicated the crime cycle.
Now we have to move forward in the timeline to September 2007. The pressure from law enforcement is severely mounting on Stacey. She knows that the police have exhumed Michael's body. She knows they have found the traces of antifreeze in his tissues. She is completely cornered by the evidence, and this is exactly where the story takes its darkest, most incomprehensible turn. She decides she needs a scapegoat to take the fall for everything.
And she does not select a random individual. She makes the calculated decision to frame her own biological daughter, Ashley Wallace, for both murders.
Let us look at the exact sequence of events in September 2007. Police investigators traveled to visit Ashley at her college campus. It was literally her first day of the school year. They sat her down and informed her that her father, Michael, had not died of a heart attack. He had been intentionally poisoned.
The psychological impact on Ashley must be considered. She is suddenly absorbing the information that her father's death was a deliberate homicide. Experiencing acute emotional distress, her immediate reaction was to contact her primary attachment figure. She telephoned her mother.
Stacey answered the phone and immediately invited Ashley to leave campus and come home to the family residence in Liverpool, New York. She suggested they sit down and have a drink together to process the news. Ashley agreed to this. You have to remember the family dynamic we discussed earlier. She viewed Stacey not just as a parental figure, but as her absolute best friend. She trusted her mother implicitly.
The following day, upon Ashley's return, Stacey initiated the protocol. She prepared and offered a specific beverage to her daughter. Ashley later provided testimony noting that the liquid was exceptionally nasty tasting. Her initial physiological response was to reject the beverage.
But Stacey relentlessly insisted. She pressured her daughter to finish it. And simply because she trusted her mother, Ashley drank the entire glass.
That fundamental familial trust was systematically weaponized. The beverage she consumed was saturated with a lethal concentration of pharmaceutical narcotics.
17 hours. You really have to stop and think about that time frame. 17 full hours passed between the moment Ashley ingested that toxic drink and the moment medical help finally arrived at the house.
In the context of acute pharmacological toxicity, 17 hours represents a catastrophic delay. Throughout that extended duration, Ashley was rendered unconscious, her central nervous system depressing, and her vital organs systematically failing. Stacey was present in the residence the entire time, maintaining proximity and effectively waiting for the biological functions of her daughter to cease.
Ashley was eventually found completely comatose in her bed, and she was not found by Stacey. She was found by her younger sister, Bree.
The intervention was entirely initiated by the younger sibling. Bree discovered her sister in an unresponsive, critical state and aggressively demanded that emergency medical services be contacted immediately. It was only in response to this direct confrontation that Stacey finally initiated the call to 911.
When the paramedics rushed into the house, Ashley was in dire critical condition. Toxicology tests performed at the hospital later revealed a massive, fatal level of prescription painkillers in her system. The absolute consensus among the treating medical professionals was that she would have died if she had been brought through those hospital doors even a few minutes later. It was that close to a third fatality.
However, prior to the emergency transport of Ashley from the residence, an additional piece of manufactured evidence was introduced into the scene, a document.
A typed note was found sitting right next to Ashley's comatose body. It was explicitly framed to read as a suicide note. And the content of this document was just explosive. It contained a full, detailed confession. It stated that Ashley was responsible for murdering both her father, Michael Wallace, and her stepfather, David Castor.
Stacey's management of this document was rapid and deliberate. She physically secured the note and immediately presented it to the responding medical personnel. Her objective was to ensure the document entered the official record instantly. She was, in a tactical sense, providing the authorities with a neatly packaged resolution to the entire dual homicide investigation.
When Ashley miraculously stabilized and eventually woke up in the intensive care unit, police detectives immediately began questioning her. They asked her directly about the two murders. They asked her about the typed confession note. Ashley was completely disoriented and confused. She vehemently denied writing any such note. She entirely denied killing her father or her stepfather. She told the detectives that the very last thing she remembered was her mother aggressively making her drink that nasty alcoholic beverage. And she noted that this was something Stacey had never, ever done before.
This presented a complex evidentiary scenario for law enforcement. They possessed a physical document containing a confession juxtaposed against a surviving subject who completely disavowed its creation. The investigative mandate was to utilize objective data to determine the factual reality of the situation.
And this is exactly where the Digital Forensics Division stepped in and blew the case wide open. The confession note was generated on a standard word processing program on the family computer. The investigator seized the hardware and analyzed the underlying metadata, specifically the creation and modification timestamps of the digital file.
The digital timestamp analysis yielded definitive chronological proof. The data confirmed that the document was drafted and saved during a specific time window when Ashley was physically present on her college campus. The geographic and chronological data rendered it a physical impossibility for Ashley to be the author. The file parameters placed the author at the terminal in the Liverpool residence while the accused was miles away attending academic functions.
That timestamp is an absolute, irrefutable piece of evidence. But the investigators found even more when they looked at the actual text. The specific content of the note itself was highly irregular.
Forensic psychiatric analysis, including subsequent commentary by experts such as Dr. James Null, highlighted severe structural anomalies within the text. Authentic suicide communications typically exhibit specific thematic markers, such as profound remorse, psychological despair, or a stated desire for the cessation of emotional pain. This fabricated document, however, was heavily structurally biased toward the exoneration of Stacey Castor. The specific thematic element of Stacey's complete innocence was reiterated 14 separate times within the text. It functioned less as a final communication of despair and more as a preemptive legal brief designed to shield the mother from prosecution.
And then there was the spelling mistake. This is one of those tiny details that feels like it was written by a Hollywood screenwriter, but it is entirely real. The specific spelling of the word antifreeze.
Throughout the text of the fabricated document, the chemical compound antifreeze was consistently misspelled as anti-free. This specific typographical error was rectified in 4 distinct locations within the narrative.
Anti-free? Why did that specific spelling become so legally significant?
The significance was established during a recorded interrogation sequence. During a formal interview with investigators, Stacey Castor verbally pronounced the word as anti-free.
She actually said it out loud on tape.
Affirmative. She vocalized the specific error. During subsequent trial proceedings, when confronted with this linguistic anomaly during cross-examination, she attempted to rationalize it by claiming she had merely interrupted her own sentence, intending to articulate a different thought entirely. However, the statistical probability of a unique verbal mispronunciation perfectly matching a repeated typographical error in a disputed document is infinitesimally small. It served as a devastating piece of circumstantial evidence linking her directly to the authorship of the forged text. It represents a phonetic encoding error, demonstrating precisely how she conceptualized and stored the vocabulary word within her own cognitive framework.
Let us move into the courtroom. The trial officially began in 2009. The formal charges brought against her were severe. Second-degree murder for the death of David Castor, attempted second-degree murder for the poisoning of her daughter Ashley, and criminal forgery regarding the manipulation of David's will. The case was led by District Attorney William Fitzpatrick.
The prosecutorial strategy was constructed upon a robust, tripartite foundation of evidence. They utilized the forensic toxicology, specifically the persistent calcium oxalate crystals found in the exhumed remains. They deployed the physical evidence, primarily the turkey baster containing the victim's DNA and the toxin. Finally, they presented the digital forensics, encompassing the file timestamps and the structural analysis of the forged confession.
They also brought in wiretap evidence, right? The prosecutors played an audio recording for the jury of Stacey talking on the phone to a friend. And on that recording, in the background, you could clearly hear the rhythmic clicking of typing sounds.
The prosecution posited that the ambient auditory data captured on the recording was, in fact, the sound of Stacey Castor actively drafting revisions of the fabricated suicide note. This theory was bolstered by Ashley's prior testimony. Ashley had stated on the record that she observed her mother working intensely on the computer during that time frame, and that Stacey had deliberately obstructed the monitor to prevent Ashley from viewing the contents of the screen.
Stacey's defense strategy in the courtroom was incredibly aggressive. They did not just try to poke holes in the timeline to create reasonable doubt. They went on the offensive and actively blamed her daughter, Ashley, for everything.
It was a highly combative and ethically severe defense posture. The defense counsel argued that Ashley had successfully murdered her biological father, Michael, when she was merely 11 years of age. They posited the motive for this initial homicide was deep-seated jealousy stemming from Michael's perceived favoritism toward the younger sibling, Bree. Subsequently, the defense argued that Ashley later murdered her stepfather, David, due to a volatile and contentious interpersonal relationship.
Blaming an 11-year-old child for executing a complex, undetectable poisoning murder is a massive logical stretch. But to sit in a courtroom and blame your own surviving daughter, the very same daughter you just tried to physically eliminate, is on a completely different level of manipulation.
It is indicative of a profound psychological desperation and a total absence of parental empathy. District Attorney Fitzpatrick aggressively dismantled this narrative during his cross-examination of the defendant. He strategically focused the jury's attention on Stacey's documented failure to initiate emergency medical protocols. He repeatedly demanded she explain the behavioral logic of a mother observing her child languish in a comatose state for 17 hours without seeking professional intervention.
Fitzpatrick was known for being intense. The court transcripts and reports from the room show he frequently raised his voice and openly challenged Castor while she was on the witness stand. He hammered home the point that she had never once sought psychiatric therapy or intervention for Ashley prior to the arrests, despite now sitting in court claiming her daughter was severely mentally ill enough to orchestrate and execute 2 separate homicides.
He systematically exposed the fundamental inconsistencies inherent in her behavioral timeline. If she genuinely harbored the belief that her daughter was a calculated serial murderer, her passive actions within the home were entirely incongruous. Conversely, if she believed her daughter was innocent and suffering a catastrophic medical event, her refusal to call an ambulance was equally inexplicable. The singular narrative structure that seamlessly integrated all established data points and timelines was the conclusion that Stacey Castor was the primary aggressor in every instance.
The jury's verdict finally came down on February 5, 2009. Stacey Castor was found guilty on all counts. The reporters in the courtroom noted that she simply closed her eyes as the guilty verdicts were read aloud by the foreman.
She sustained convictions for the second-degree murder of David Castor, the attempted second-degree murder of Ashley Wallace, and the forgery charge pertaining to the fraudulent alteration of the testamentary documents.
The formal sentencing took place exactly a month later, on March 5, 2009, and the presiding judge, Judge Fahey, absolutely did not hold back his assessment of her character.
The judicial sentencing was maximal. He imposed a sentence of 25 years to life for the homicide of David Castor. He levied an additional consecutive sentence of 25 years for the attempted homicide of her daughter. Additional penal time was factored in for the forgery conviction. The aggregate judicial mandate was 51 1/3 years to life in state prison.
Given her age at the time of sentencing, she was 41 years old. This massive number was effectively a life sentence behind bars. She was never getting out.
The declarative statements made by Judge Fahey during the sentencing phase were analytically significant. He stated for the record that throughout his entire judicial career, he had never encountered a scenario wherein a parent systematically attempted to terminate the life of their own offspring for the explicit purpose of utilizing them as a legal decoy for their own prior crimes. It was during this specific summation that he legally categorized her behavior as existing within a class all by herself.
The victim impact statement delivered by Ashley to the court is just incredibly heartbreaking to read. She stood up and expressed a profound hatred for what her mother had done to her, but she also admitted the agonizing reality that she still loved her. She told the court, "I never knew what hate was until now. Even though I do hate her, I still love her at the same time." That bothers me. It's so confusing.
That emotional ambivalence is a highly documented psychological phenomenon among survivors of severe familial abuse. The fundamental biological and psychological bond between a child and a primary caregiver does not simply dissolve instantaneously, even in the aftermath of extreme trauma or an overt attempt on the child's life. It generates a complex, lifelong psychological architecture characterized by profound cognitive dissonance and enduring emotional trauma.
Immediately after the trial concluded, the national media really descended on the story. The Black Widow moniker became permanently attached to her name in the press. ABC's News Magazine 2020 produced a massive special on the case, and Stacey actually agreed to do a sit-down interview with them where she steadfastly maintained her complete innocence. She looked right at the camera and said, quote, "Ashley brought this on."
She maintained an unwavering commitment to that fabricated narrative structure. Dr. James Knoll, the forensic psychiatrist we referenced previously, categorized this behavioral pattern as the deny, deny, deny code. He provided expert commentary noting that highly psychopathic individuals possess a specific cognitive trait that allows them to categorize other human beings, including their own biological offspring, purely as functional objects. Within Stacey's psychological framework, Ashley ceased to be a daughter and became merely an instrument, an object to be strategically deployed to terminate the law enforcement investigation directed at herself.
Both of the surviving daughters, Ashley and Bree, permanently severed all contact with their mother after the trial. Ashley gave a subsequent statement to the press saying, "I would have done anything for her, but she tried to kill me instead."
The actions of the perpetrator resulted in the complete and absolute destruction of the entire familial unit.
Now, there was also a lingering, very dark suspicion regarding yet another death in the family timeline. Stacey's own father, Jerry Daniels, had passed away several years earlier in 2002.
The district attorney's office publicly noted that the investigative team harbored significant suspicions regarding Stacey's potential involvement in that specific fatality as well. The circumstances were highly irregular. Jerry Daniels was hospitalized for a relatively minor respiratory complaint. Stacey visited his hospital room. During that visitation, she provided him with an opened, unsealed can of a commercial soda beverage. Within a very short time frame following the consumption of the liquid, he experienced a catastrophic medical event and died. Subsequently, Stacey assumed the role of the primary executor of his financial estate.
That sequence of events fits her exact operational pattern perfectly. The introduction of a liquid carrier, The sudden fatal medical event, the immediate realization of financial gain, and assuming control of the assets as executor. But despite the suspicions, she was never formally charged with his death.
That is correct. Formal legal proceedings were never initiated regarding that specific incident. However, the theoretical model of her involvement remains highly credible among the law enforcement personnel who analyzed her behavioral continuum, as well as among surviving extended family members.
After the sentencing, Stacey Castor was transferred to the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She spent the next several years of her life incarcerated there.
And that location serves as the terminal point of her biographical timeline. On June 11, 2016, Stacey Castor was discovered deceased within her assigned cell block.
She was only 48 years old at the time. What was the official medical cause of her death?
The initial reports classified the cause of death as undetermined pending investigation. However, following a comprehensive medical review, the district attorney's office released a statement confirming that she suffered a massive, fatal myocardial infarction, a heart attack. The autopsy protocols confirmed there was absolutely no physical or toxicological evidence indicating suicide or the involvement of an external party.
So in this incredibly strange, almost cinematic twist of fate, the very woman who aggressively faked a heart attack narrative to cover up the murder of her first husband and then faked a complex suicide narrative to cover up the murder of her second, ultimately died of an actual natural heart attack alone in a prison cell.
It represents a definitive biological cessation to a highly chaotic and extraordinarily destructive behavioral narrative.
When we look back at the entirety of this case, across all the years and all the evidence, it really is the sheer scale of the betrayal that stands out the most.
Yeah.
You have two husbands who are dead.
Yeah.
You have a daughter who was nearly murdered and then systematically framed to take the fall for everything. An entire family tree was completely destroyed, all driven by a toxic combination of financial greed and an absolute chilling dedication to self-preservation.
And we must also recognize the profound structural irony embedded within the physical evidence, specifically regarding the fabricated confession document. The very instrument she meticulously manufactured to ensure her own freedom, the tool designed to shift the entirety of the legal burden onto her child, ultimately functioned as the primary catalyst for her own conviction. The digital file timestamps and her own unique phonetic typographical errors illuminated the factual reality that she had labored so intensively to conceal.
It is a really stark reminder to all of us. It makes you think about how fragility and absolute trust can be so completely exploited by someone who entirely lacks the capacity for human empathy. And it leaves you wondering about the burden placed on the survivors. Because you look at Ashley and Bree and you realize they have to spend the rest of their lives navigating the world knowing that they literally share the DNA of someone capable of that level of profound calculated destruction. It raises terrifying questions about the legacy of trauma versus biology.
It is a highly complex psychological burden to carry.
Thanks for listening.